When the word church is used, what image comes into your mind? Some people use the term church house, referring to a building where the church meets. Other people refer to a group of people meeting down the street. And some people use the term church for denomination. But what is the church? Peter Savage gives a number of definitions for the church and the way it is used in modern language. He says, first of all, that the church is a lecture hall. It's a place where we go to hear the Bible expounded. Secondly, he says, the church is a theater. It's a place where we see the drama of Christ's life reenacted. And still thirdly, it is a corporation. It's a place that is program-oriented. It's retailing religion to the masses. And finally, he says that some people in our modern world look at the church as a social club. It is a place where certain needs, emotional and social, are met in our world. But what is the church? Is the church a hierarchy or is it a community? Is the church an organization or is the church an organism?
We are one in the Spirit, we are one in the Lord, we are one in the Spirit, we are one in the Lord, and we pray that our unity may one day be restored, and they'll know we are Christians by our love, by our love, yes, they'll know we are Christians by our love. We will walk with each other.
God said it is not good that man should be alone. It is God's design for man that he be a part of mankind. He designed man to have a need to love and to be loved. But God did not just design man with these needs and throw him out into an environment that would not fulfill these needs. The church is a fellowship of believers. It is God's designed place where the need to love and to be loved can be met. It is important for us as we study the church to look at biblical statements regarding what the church is. And I want us to look at three words in the New Testament that describes the church. The first is a word that is used by the Apostle Paul so often about the church, and that is the concept of the church as a body. The church being a body of Christ is talked about in many passages in the Bible, and I would like to just walk through one long passage in 1 Corinthians 12 to try to look again at the concept of the church as the body. In verse 12 of 1 Corinthians 12, Paul says, "For as the body is one and has many members, but all the members of that one body, being many, are one body, so also is Christ." Verse 13, "For by one Spirit were we all baptized into one body." Verse 14, "For in fact the body is not one member, but many." And notice how people are put into the church. Verse 18, "But now God has set the members, each of them in the body, just as He pleased." Verse 20, "But now indeed there are many members, yet one body." And then he begins to describe some of the functions of the body. The functions of our body's members are simply to aid and help the total body. Listen to what he says. Verse 21, "And the eye cannot say to the hand, I have no need of you. Nor again the head to the feet, I have no need of you." You see, we all have functions. We all are part of the body. We are for the building up of the body. And then in verse 25 he says, "But that members should have the same care for one another. If one member suffers, they all suffer. If one member is honored, they're all honored." The concept of the body presents the church as an environment where relationships are formed and where we can care one for another. The other word that is used to describe the church in the New Testament is the word household or house. This passage is in the New Testament as well, the passage that says that how you ought to behave yourself in the house of God, which is the church of the living God, the pillar and ground of the truth. 1 Timothy 3 and verse 15. And in this concept of household, it is more of a concept not of a house or a building of brick and mortar or wood, but it's a building of people. And Beck, in his translation, says the family of God. And this is really what the word seems to mean. The word oikos means family of God, the place where God lives. When we look at the concept of family or household, we are looking again at the concept of caring members of a family, caring for other members of a family. And when we look at the concept of body, it's members of the body caring for one another, just as family members care for one another. So again, the concept is the concept of a community, a fellowship, of a relationship. In fact, the third word that I would like to use is a word that is translated sometimes fellowship, sometime partnership, and sometimes just simply communion. It's the word fellowship. The word fellowship is often used in the Bible to refer to God's people as community. The word koinonia, for instance, means partnership, joint participation. But there are various levels of participation. When you look at the church as designed by God, it is designed to build relationships. And in these relationships, they are spiritual relationships that are designed by God to be within the local church. Now, there are relationships that we have outside the church. There are all kinds of fellowship that we have outside the local body. For instance, as we move to this area, there are a number of things that beget fellowship. That is, there are things that are causing fellowship in our lives. Some of momentous importance and some of not very momentous importance. When I was about 5 or 6 years old, my tricycle broke. And one of my friends got his friend to come over, and we worked on that tricycle for about a week, trying to get it to work. And as little tights, we were trying to make something work that really was impossible. But there was a sweet fellowship, a friendship, a partnership, because we had something going. We had a joint venture. There are people that you have been involved with joint ventures. And these have been very good and warm fellowships. But what happens when the venture ends? When that trip that you're taking together or that involvement that you are engaged in ends, then the fellowship ends. There's another level of fellowship where we call the commitment to an idea. There may be 2 or 3 people who might have an idea, and they have a same idea, and they work in this idea, and they develop this idea. And while this idea is being developed, they are committed to it. And there is the fellowship. But when the idea is completed or no longer important to them, then the fellowship is gone. There's even a higher fellowship, a commitment to an ideal. This is a commitment to some moral truth, or what we believe to be some moral truth. It might be to the upbuilding of a democratic society, or it might be things relative to morals in the community. It might be an anti-pornography ideal that we're working with. There are a number of ideals. It may be getting the drunks off the highway, or it might be drug education in the high schools. These are commitments to ideals, and we're working, and we have great fellowship. And organizations that I have participated in who are working for an ideal, I've found some sweet and wonderful, warm fellowship. But when that ideal is gone or it's accomplished, then we move on to something else. And where does the fellowship go? Well, it goes out the window. The greatest of all fellowships is the commitment to a person. And this is really what we're talking about when we're talking about the church as a fellowship of believers. Because you see, the church is a group of people committed to the person of Jesus Christ. If we are to define the church in biblical terms, we can talk about it being a body. We can talk about it being a house or household. We can talk about it being a fellowship. But in all of those words, in all of those concepts, we're really talking about commitment to a person. Let's look at one other concept here in regard to another passage in the New Testament. A passage in 1 John 1 and verse 3. This passage is a very simple passage, but it tells us about fellowship in the body. John says, "These things I'm writing to you, that you might have fellowship with us. And our fellowship is with the Father and with His Son, Jesus Christ." I want you to notice what's happening here. John says, "I'm writing these things to you." And we can say this man here is John. John says, "I'm writing these things to you," to another man, to another Christian, "in order that you might have fellowship with us." In other words, as we look at the Scriptures and we come face to face with the person of Jesus, we are actually brought into fellowship with each other. Now John goes ahead and says, he says, "And our fellowship is with the Father and with His Son, Jesus Christ." So in a way, it's a triangle. My fellowship with you in the body of Christ is based upon my relationship with God. The horizontal fellowship in the body is based upon the vertical relationship in God. These things we write, that you might have fellowship with us, because our fellowship is with the Father and with His Son, Jesus Christ. Now there's another concept here. At this distance, we might feel that there is no real good fellowship. Fellowship that is meaningful and warm and pleasant. But notice what happens on this triangle. As I move up closer to God, and as you move up closer to God, we find that what happens is we move closer to each other. And that's a beautiful concept. I was talking about this a few years ago up in South Dakota, and one of the college students there came up and said, "Look, the closer you move to God, the closer you move to me." And it dawned on me, that's what the Bible really teaches. The more we are committed to the person of Jesus Christ and to God the Father, and the closer we get to God, the closer we get to each other. And it's a beautiful fellowship. Now, in life, fellowship forms in natural ways. For instance, there are fellowships around certain concepts. Here, for instance, is a picture of some skiers. There is a fellowship among those skiers because they enjoy skiing. And if they are all members of the local church, there will be a wonderful fellowship among those skiers. I know a church in Nebraska that takes its whole congregation out to Colorado and skis every winter. There's a great fellowship that they enjoy. But suppose there's somebody in the local church who doesn't like to ski, doesn't like to think about skiing, and doesn't like to talk about skiing. Then fellowship is going to have to be in another area. It's going to have to be on some basis greater than what we like to do in skiing. Another example is that all of us have likes and dislikes. Some of you might enjoy this pumpkin pie. Others of you might say, "My dessert is cake." Well, we have likes and we have dislikes. But our fellowship is not around a pumpkin pie or a chocolate cake. Our fellowship is commitment to a person. There are others of you who have a partnership, a joint participation. You feel good and warm in each other's company because you work at the same job. A few years ago, we did a workshop on loving encounters, as we're doing here on the film, in a western Nebraska city. And almost everybody there worked for a railroad company. And we got together that night and they talked about railroad. Tim and I knew very little about railroading, but they did, and they talked about it. They felt warm about each other because that was their job. Here, for instance, is a picture of three men who have the same job. They have the same career goals. They even wear the same color ties. They have a fellowship. They feel good about each other. But that fellowship is a natural fellowship based upon a job, a position, or a status in life. There is a natural relationship as well in local congregations dependent upon marriage status. For instance, people with young children congregate around other families with young children. Here are a number of pictures of mothers with children or small children around, and every time you find one family with small children, you'll find some other families with small children congregating around them because they have a natural sharing based upon marital status. The thing that's so very important for us to understand in this concept is not that we build a fellowship around natural things, but we go back and we build a fellowship around the triangle, the supernatural things. So my fellowship is with you, and your fellowship is with me, not because we like the same cake, not because we like the same sport, not because we have the same family or job status, but because we are jointly united with God through Christ. It is in this concept of the church that the church begins to function as God designed it. God designed the church as a place where the need to love and be loved could be met. The church, you see, according to God's Word and God's design, is a fellowship of believers. Tim, when people have legitimate needs, they will meet those needs. Now, the question that is before us is, if people will go to any extremes to meet those needs, what must we as the church be to be the appropriate environment for the needs to be met?
I think it is fair to say that people will go to almost any extreme to meet their needs, especially when they feel those needs deeply. The tragedy of the world is that though they're searching so hard for a place where those needs can be met, so few people are able to find such a place. They remind me of the person who's at the bottom of the swimming pool that we talked about the other day. Here this person is at the bottom of a pool wanting desperately to breathe, and yet they're in an environment that will kill them as they try to meet that need. That's how it is with fellowship. People are looking for fellowship, wanting fellowship, searching for it. And yet time after time they find themselves in an environment that is totally inappropriate.
That reminds me of a story of a young man in one of the north central states. A number of years ago, before he became a Christian, he used to, every time the whistle would blow at the plant where he worked, which was an automobile plant, he and a bunch of his cronies would go to the local tavern. And he enjoyed himself at the local tavern. And I asked him one time after he had quit doing this, and he was on the verge of really getting to the point of not able to control his drinking. I said, "Why did you do that?" He said, "Well, at the time, I looked at it as a real good time. I was with my friends. I could say what I wanted to say. I could do what I wanted to do, and I just felt good." He said, "I was seeking something. I was seeking a fellowship." And I said, "Well, how do you look at it now?" And he said, "Well, I was seeking something that could not be found in a tavern. I was seeking for deep relationships, but you don't get deep relationships in an environment like that." And I still remember what he said at the conclusion of that conversation. He said, "I look at it now as simply an exercise of crying in each other's beer."
That's a pretty good description of what happens with relationships in the world. Here people are trying to find fellowship and ending up crying in each other's beer. But should it really surprise us that the very God who made this need we have for fellowship, for relationship, should it surprise us that that God has also created an environment in which that need can be met? It's the church. That is the environment that God has created, this fellowship of believers, this relationship place where we can come together and meet that need to love and to be loved, that need for relationship that each one of us has.
Well, the writer of the Hebrews 10 says that we should consider one another to provoke to love and good works. So it's in the church as God designed it, so that we can build each other up, the word edification, that we encourage each other to be what God intended that we be. We love people and we receive love as God designed it in the church.
And when the church functions as it ought to, then we have a place to go where fellowship needs can be met. But what about when the church doesn't function that way, James? What about when the church fails to function in a way that promotes relationship? When that happens, people are going to die. They'll either stay in the church and suffocate to death, or they'll run out to other environments, trying to find other places to meet this need, and they'll be breathing, but they'll be breathing in an atmosphere that's poisonous, one that kills them.
The man who goes to the local tavern or to a social club or anything else to meet a need that God can give him in the church is actually breathing at the bottom of the pool. He's breathing, trying to meet his needs in an inappropriate way. I think that is why Francis Schaeffer wrote the statement that he did that I mentioned earlier in one of our sessions. Schaeffer said, unless the church changes its form and gets back to community and the sharing of lives personally, the church is done. What he was saying is the church was designed by God to fulfill certain needs. And unless the church does that, then the church will be done. It'll be finished. We have a choice to make as Christian people. We either work to make the church a proper place where the need to love and be loved can be met, or we see people leaving the church and going out into inappropriate environments and gasping to fulfill their needs. The choice is really ours.
We